Hi, this is Stephanie. Let me tell you a story. This is part two of chapter three of my long form work in progress, The Infinite Library. Chapter three is called Interjob. And just a quick trigger warning on this one for a brief description of violence against a child. Niles was still on his throne several hours later, having had a parade of peasants pass before him. Each was accompanied by one of his advisers, and each was begging his indulgence for something. Many times it was a request to forego or reduce the amount of tax paid for that growing season, as the crops had been quite poor and the people were having difficulty getting enough together to pay the tax and feed their families. There were a few instances of disagreements between landholders and tenants, usually because the landholders wanted to rent the land out to someone who would pay them more for the same poor piece of land, and the tenants refused to leave. By and large, it was a series of audiences that didn't require any real decision making from Niles, simply a symbolic nodding of the head, but it infuriated him nonetheless. Niles knew what his universe required of him and what expectations his role in this universe meant he had to meet. He was meant to be a cruel, unfeeling regent, hard on his people and determined to make the most out of their labor and the land while giving back as little as he could get away with. Bad growing seasons and poor conditions were nothing to one as such as he, as long as he received his just tribute and the respect due his crown and title. As such, he had to let his advisers have their way with the peasants in his audiences, demanding the taxes be paid and the tenants be removed from land the landholders wished to rent out on more favorable terms. At least in the second instance, the landholders also had to increase the amount of taxes they owed to the crown, so they didn't see much by way of a profit in changing tenants. Niles was rather proud of that addition, and the way his advisers had looked upon him with approval when he suggested it. There was only one case left on the schedule for the day, and then Niles could retreat from the throne room and hide away in his study, or in the gardens, or anywhere that wasn't the room where he allowed such terrible things to happen to his people. He nodded to the page at the door, who opened the door and bowed low, allowing the people to enter the room. Niles noticed that this group seemed different than the ones he'd seen the rest of the day. Instead of one or two stout, stalwart men, or even one or two malnourished, desperate men, the people being ushered in were women. Two adult women, their heads and faces covered modestly by the veils their religion required, led a small girl in between them. The girl was young enough that she did not have to wear a veil, and so Niles could see her face. That was unfortunate for the man being ushered in by two of his guards, both with and separate from the group of women. The girl's face was bruised, and her lower lip looked as though it had split recently. There was still blood on the skin. She had also been crying, and tears were still running down her face, but she was doing everything she could to keep herself from sobbing. Niall's heart broke as he saw her tiny fists clench and her chest hitch with a breath that wanted to turn into a wail of pain. The women on either side of her had hands on her shoulders, both steering her into the room and comforting her with their presence. Niles turned to the adviser who brought the group in. "What is the nature of this request?" he asked, the standard language for beginning an audience. He kept his voice under control, but it was difficult when he could see both the girl's injured face and the man's scraped knuckles and the way he kept glaring at the women as though they were dirt on his sandal. The adviser, one who had been working with Niles since before he had taken the throne, cleared his throat and read from a scroll in front of him. "Your Excellency, the matter stands that Jacob, father of Leah, husband of Sarah, wishes to make a complaint about both his daughter Leah and his wife Sarah in regards to his granddaughter Esther. Esther disturbed Jacob's rest after a long day of work, and when Jacob punished her as is his right under the law, Leah and Sarah berated him, using their sharp tongues to injure him with their words and their evil glares to cause his spirit harm, before leaving the home with Esther. He wants to ensure that Leah and Sarah are unable to take such actions again, and so demands that you put out their eyes and rip out their tongues, thus taking from them their only weapons." The scroll shook a bit by the end of the statement, and Niles could see his advisor was shocked by what he was being asked to read. Beale took a long, deep gulp from his hazelnut mocha latte and sighed. No matter how good the baristas in his universe were, they still didn't hold a candle to the real thing he could get in Prime. He had to remind himself that Prime wasn't meant for people like him, and that going there was a privilege that could easily be taken away from him at a moment's notice if need be. He didn't want to end up one of those Prime junkies he saw outside the library sometimes, begging for some scrap of Prime to add to their collections. There were whispers about people that had tried to make the jump to Prime permanently, and while some had supposedly been successful for a little while, none had ever lasted more than a Prime year. Prime as a universe simply wasn't meant for people from other universes. It was a nice place to visit, though. Beale kept scrolling through the text thread with Kelly, smiling as he saw the different emojis she used to tell him she was following for him. He had responded in kind, of course, because what kind of boyfriend didn't use the same language as his girlfriend? A monster, that's who. He'd already let her know he was back, and they had scheduled to meet up for dinner in a few hours at their favorite Italian restaurant. Beale had already called the restaurant to make sure their favorite table was able to be reserved, and of course, everything worked like a dream. It was one of the best parts about being a major character in a universe. Generally, whatever they wanted, they got. Granted, there were consequences at times, but only for the really big stuff. The kind that involved changing the world somehow or getting married or divorced. Things like restaurant reservations, on the other hand, were par for the course. Once he'd drained the last of his disappointing coffee, Beale stood up from the wrought iron bench where he'd been sitting and threw the cup into a nearby trash can before making his way back to his apartment. He had some time to shower and possibly nap before he saw Kelly, and he wanted to make sure he was rested and refreshed for her. He knew logically that it hadn't been that long since she'd seen him, but to him it had felt like ages. He was a little concerned, not jealous, never that she was mentioning Trevor so much in her texts. It seemed that she was spending more time with him when Beale was away. He needed to remind her how he felt about her and have a proper reunion. And this chapter looks like it's going to at least a part 3. So if you want to see more, you can check it out on Royal Road, which is linked to from my blog, insertscenehere.blogspot.com. Otherwise, I should be putting out a video with the next section soon-ish, hopefully. I really need to get on a schedule for this kind of thing, but that seems like a future me problem. Anyway, thanks so much for listening y hasta pronto.